Right now, temperatures are much cooler than average for much of the eastern half of the United States. Of course, as a result of this trough that's located over New England, that's bringing very heavy rain, and many areas in the Northeast could experience flooding associated with this storm system after waves of heavy rain move through over the past several days. And this low pressure system is expected to stick around over the Northeast for several days, which will mean that temperatures will be much cooler than average for the most part for the Great Lakes region, as well as the Northeast, where you could expect temperatures hovering around 20 to 30 degrees below average as this trough continues to meander over the Northeast, and is expected to stick around for the next several days because there is a blocking pattern going on where there's a negative tilt with the jet stream. So there's a big ridge located over eastern Canada that's trying to steer the low pressure system towards the west, and the jet stream is also in a position where the winds are moving towards the west, which is of course opposite of where the jet stream typically moves in the mid latitudes, where we see the winds move from a westerly to easterly direction, but this ridge is preventing that from occurring. So we're going to see this low pressure system move further inland, which is definitely not something we see very often with troughs moving through the Northeast, because the westerly winds typically are too strong. But in this scenario, we have a big ridge that's steering this low pressure system further inland, and that's expected to make this low pressure system stick around over the next several days, which is the reason why it's going to be very ugly when it comes to as we approach the month of May, where we're mainly going to see rain showers as well as temperatures much colder than average, to a point where some areas in Michigan and even Wisconsin could experience some snowfall. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see that snow move into Pennsylvania as well, especially in the higher elevations. Potentially Ohio could get involved with some snow showers, as it's suddenly a rare sight to see snow this late into the spring season. We're now in the month of May, but since we're seeing a very significant jet stream dip along with a powerful low that's bringing strong northerly winds to push that Arctic air further southward, we're going to see temperatures much colder than average over the next several days. And I wouldn't say it's until next week by the time this low pressure system moves out to sea by Thursday and finally the Friday timeframe. That's when the low pressure system should finally move out for the most part, but the northerly winds will still be there. So temperatures will hover below average for much of this week, and it wouldn't be until next week we'll actually begin to see those more spring-like temperatures hovering around the 70s in a lot of areas in the Northeast, which is definitely a welcome sight to see if you're into the warmer temperatures and you're ready for the summer to approach, because of course this trough isn't going to help bring those warmer temperatures to the Northeast. So as it moves away by next week, we should see the temperatures rebound, and that's when we're going to see a big warm up. And also part of the reason why the temperatures are cooler than average is because there's a big positive Pacific oscillation going on, where we're seeing we're seeing a big ridge over this area that's bringing mainly warmer than average temperatures, but that's expected to change along the west coast as well, because we have this trough moving through. Let me show you guys a 500 millibar height anomaly to show you guys to give you guys a better representation of what I'm talking about. So this is how the 500 millibar height anomaly is looking like as of right now based on the GFS models forecast, and we do see that there's this big trough over the northeastern portion of the United States that's expected to linger around over the next several days, bringing much cooler than average temperatures. But we have a big ridge located along the west coast that for most of the west coast it's bringing warmer than average conditions. But we do see that a trough is expected to move along the west coast, along the coast of Oregon, California as well, and the next few troughs moving along the west coast should also be very slow when it comes to movement, because this big ridge is gonna sort of also act like a blocking ridge that's going to block this trough from making much progress towards the east. So it's going to linger around California and surrounding states for quite some time because of this blocking ridge. And this low pressure system is going to cut off from the jet stream completely, which means that it'll be an upper level low. So that means that the speed of this low pressure system will be a lot lower. Towards the velocity will be a lot smaller towards the east, which means that the low pressure system will be more likely to meander over the west coast and bring rainy and much cooler than average conditions, as we're seeing right here. And it's not until a pretty big significant jet stream dip moves through before we eventually begin to see the troughs make progress towards the east, but that's going to take a while, as you could see. But in terms of when temperatures should warm up along the eastern half of the United States, like I said, it should warm up by early next week, because again, this trough will eventually move out to sea, and so will the northerly winds associated with the western portion of this trough. So we're going to see this ridge that's located right over Canada move further southward, and we're going to see temperatures warm up as a result by next week. And if you're wondering the magnitude, let me show you guys right now of how big this warm up will be for much of the United States. So these are how the temperature anomalies are looking right now, and for the most part, much of the eastern half of the United States is experiencing temperatures anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees below average, of course, due to the strong northerly winds. But on the west coast, you're seeing temperatures much above average for the most part, hovering between 10 to 20 degrees above average outside of those along the coast of California, Oregon, as well as Washington. Of course, the cooler than average Pacific sea surface temperatures are certainly contributing to the cooler than average temperatures along the coast. So even if the temperatures are above average further inland along the western half of the United States, it might not necessarily be the case along the immediate coast, because Pacific temperatures are much cooler than average, which part of the reason is because we experience many atmospheric rivers along the west coast. But we do see that for most of the west coast, or at least most of the western half of the United States, temperatures are much above average. And in terms of how long this should continue, so moving forward with the forecast, we see that temperatures should become even more cooler than average, where we saw temperatures close to 30 degrees below average in certain areas of the Midwest. This includes Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, the western portion of Pennsylvania, as well as West Virginia. And we even see the cooler than average temperatures extend into the more coastal areas of the Northeast as well. But we do see that, as well as not only the Northeast will experience cooler than average conditions over next week, we also see the coast of California, thanks to the next few troughs coming ashore along the coast. That's going to certainly contribute to the temperatures being much colder than average. When we see more moisture, that means that there's more clouds in the sky that are going to block the short wave radiation from getting absorbed by the surface, and that's the reason why California will likely experience cooler than average conditions for the foreseeable future. And we do see that the much cooler than average temperatures continue 10 to 20 degrees below average over the next several days. But we do see that still much of the western half of the United States is experiencing warmer than average conditions, and that warmth is expected to spread further and further eastward very slowly, but it's certainly going to be making progress. We're going to need to wait and see how fast the ridge builds and how quickly this low pressure system moves. That really all depends on how long this blocking ridge stays over eastern Canada, but it should most likely leave by this upcoming weekend. So temperatures along northeast should be much colder than average, but be prepared for a big warm up by next week, where we're going to see temperatures fall more in line closer to average by the time we approach early next week, and even much above average for the central United States, where you could experience temperatures close to 100 in certain areas of Oklahoma and Texas, thanks to how strong a ridge is expected to build over those areas. So make sure to keep that in mind. And we're going to see a pattern change as well for a larger area of the west coast, where temperatures for the most part will be closer to average, if not cooler than average, for a lot of the west coast as we approach early next week as well. So make sure to pay close attention to that. So this is a blocking pattern that I'm talking about. So we have a big ridge centered over eastern Canada, and we have a significant low pressure system right over the northern Great Lakes that's bringing a strong northerly flow to bring that Arctic air further southward, and that is going to linger over the next several days, because this ridge is very strong, it's very persistent, and it's definitely going to block this low pressure system from having an easy way out to sea, since the jet stream winds are going to shift a little bit towards the west, which will force the low pressure system to move westward as a result. So we're going to see this low pressure system along with the cold stay over this area, I'll say, until the Monday time frame. Of course, the temperatures are not the only thing you need to worry about in the Northeast and the Great Lakes associated with this storm system. You also need to worry about the amount of rain and potentially snow you're going to experience from this storm system. Already in many areas of the Northeast, you experience close to, if not over, 3 inches of rain, including where I'm located in New Jersey, where many rivers are expected to crest above flood stage, as we've experienced numerous thunder showers move through the area over throughout the day, which has led to many rivers reaching flood stage here in northern New Jersey and surrounding areas. But moving forward with the forecast to see how much more precipitation you should expect in the Northeast over the next several days. So this area of heavy rainfall should move out by early to midday on Monday. That's when we should see the low pressure system begin to move a little bit further westward, and we're going to see more of that moisture up towards Canada, but we're going to still see scattered rain showers throughout Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Ohio over the next several days. And continuing to move forward with the forecast, we see that the rain just continues into Ohio into Monday night and even into Tuesday. The scattered rain showers continue, so it's going to be a very ugly week when it comes to weather for much of the Northeast and the Midwest, thanks to this blocking pattern, and much cooler than average. And we could see snow in the higher elevations of Pennsylvania and West Virginia as early as Wednesday or Tuesday evening, so keep that in mind as well. But in terms of rainfall, you shouldn't expect much more rainfall in a lot of these areas, as the heaviest rainfall has moved just to the Northeast. But just keep in mind that it should be a very ugly week and when it comes to weather for much of the Northeast when it comes to rain, as well as much cooler than average temperatures. So make sure to be prepared and don't store away those coats just yet, because you're certainly going to need them with temperatures that are going to be 10 to 20 degrees below average, like I said. In terms of the amount of rainfall you should expect over the next 5 days, like I said, the worst of the rain has moved out for the most part for most of the Northeast, but there's still areas, especially in the higher elevations of Pennsylvania and interior Northeast, where you could experience anywhere from 1 to 3 inches of rain. So make sure to prepare accordingly, and remember that even during a flash flood, it doesn't necessarily need to rain a lot for a flash flood to occur. All that's really required for a flash flood is a heavy amount of rain at a very fast rate. So even if you're not necessarily expected to receive that much more total rainfall, remember, all it takes is one thunderstorm to potentially bring a significant and life-threatening flash flooding threat. So don't underestimate the potential of flooding just because the total rainfall isn't necessarily very high. And of course, we already experience up to 3 inches of rain and even more in many areas of the Northeast, which of course already contributed to the rivers being much higher. So you should expect river flooding in many of these areas over the next several days, as typically rivers take a little bit longer after the rain period for them to crest at their peak. So make sure to be aware of that as over the next several days if you live in a flood prone area. Another thing I want to show you guys is the Arctic Oscillation, and if you take a look at the Arctic Oscillation Index, you clearly see why temperatures are much colder than average for much of the eastern half of the United States, and that's because we're in the negative oscillation phase, which typically means that we're prone to have a lot more jet stream dips because the westerly winds are a lot weaker. So the westerly winds are less likely to trap that Arctic air towards the polar regions, and the polar and the Arctic air is more likely to meander further southward without the strong westerly winds preventing the cold air from moving southwards. So as a result, we should expect the cooler than average temperatures for much of the eastern half of the United States over the next several days before by next week, like I said, we should see the Arctic oscillation fall more in line closer to average, which means that temperatures should rebound by next week once this trough moves through and the westerly winds become stronger to prevent the polar air to move further southwards. So we should see that warm up by next week, but over the next 5 days, remember to bundle up because it's still going to be cold in many areas. So here's my forecast in general when it comes to this next major pattern change. So the major warm up for much of the eastern half of the United States should happen by early next week. There could maybe be that possibility it might happen earlier, like maybe starting Sunday or a Saturday, depending on how fast this trough moves. But based on how persistent this blocking ridge is over eastern Canada, I'd place my bets that the warm up will more likely happen next week for much of the eastern half of the United States. And make sure to prepare for much cooler than average conditions for the foreseeable future, at least around the immediate coasts of California and Oregon, where you're going to see troughs just stay over the same area for several days, which will certainly reduce the amount of short-wave radiation that gets absorbed and the warmth that exists in the west coast. So make sure to pay close attention to the cooler than average temperatures for much of the western half of the United States for the foreseeable future. But I thank you guys for watching.